Greetings, brothers and sisters. So, I have a completely different way of viewing the subjects of slavery and oppression and victimhood and all these things because of just personal experience, things that I've seen on every level of society. And so, I thought it would be important for people to understand what I'm saying here to explain some of my, give some more personal information about my journey as an introduction to this subject to understand, my point of view and where I'm coming from here. To start off with, I'd always been sort of an outsider in America, in my American experience, somebody who wasn't, didn't fit into the sort of boxes and things like this. And I didn't know it. Like as a kid, I didn't know it. Like a kid, I didn't, understand that there was, like I wasn't fitting in, right? Like I thought I was or whatever it was. I was having some trouble at school, but I didn't even know I was having trouble. I thought I was doing great. My mom was concerned and took me for some testing, like psychological testing, IQ testing, and I had some sort of learning disability. That's what, I was told. I didn't, really think much of it, right? I had trouble with my D's and B's and uh, P's and Q's and things like this, where, I would make them in reverse because I eventually found out I had dyslexia and when I was in my 30s, which was very odd. My mom was like, I don't know, obsessed with problems. She was always sort of looking at the negative of things. She was a spiritual person and could be positive and had faith, but she was, it's like I was just a kid being happy being a kid and I didn't, experience any struggles, but she had these ideas that I had allergies and she was constantly obsessed with that and I had trouble handwriting, and I had because of dyslexia, which would not come out till much later in life. So she took me for these tests, I guess based in the school recommendation. I don't know how it works. I was like 7 or 8, right? And I did really well. Like I had a high IQ, but there was some like I don't know learning disability stuff there. And my mom very specifically said you don't have dyslexia, and I was like, okay, like I didn't care, like whatever it was. But she was lying because later, when my ex was homeschooling my kids, and some of them had, some of these same things, my brother has horrible handwriting. My dad used to have a mix where he would print and cursive in the same word. Like you couldn't read his handwriting. And so, I struggled as a handwriter, right, in terms of, you know, and it's funny because all three of us, my dad, my brother, and myself, have written books, but we all have horrible handwriting and things. But, anyways, she specifically said I didn't have dyslexia. Then my kids were struggling, and my ex was doing some research on this and said, send me some links. And I looked at it and I was like, wow, I have it, right? It was clear that I have dyslexia. So I called my mom, like 30 something. I said, Mom, I have dyslexia. And she goes, oh, yeah, of course you do. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me? And she didn't like say anything. But she put all this emphasis on telling me that I had something wrong, like some sort of learning disability, which, like I didn't, I mean, for the most part, I didn't pay attention to, but it was, there. And I guess it brought awareness to my struggle in school in just some areas because, I was an avid reader. I would read on my own. I had like a 12th grade reading level when I was in elementary school. Like I would go do research on my favorite animals when I was a little kid. We had these encyclopedias, and I read on my own. And I actually was doing research about things I was interested in when I was a kid. So I was, I had a high level of comprehension. Some of these other things, but she focused on this idea that I had these issues, some sort of issues. Obviously the handwriting thing, and but never really said, all right, this is what it is. She didn't want to tell me, like she was worried I was going to develop low self-esteem. I don't know what it is, right? Just messed up stuff. Very incompetent. My parents were, my mom was a worrier and incompetent and, second guessing herself all the time. But I'm saying this because being introverted and dyslexic, and I was different than the other kids, but didn't really experience that because we would, go out and play and do whatever we were doing as kids, right? And so I just assumed that I was fitting in, right? Because, of course, in elementary school I was. But there are other things too. Like if I was watching a Western, usually I would root for the Indians, right? It would be cowboys and Indians. And for some reason, I would root for the Indians. Later on, I felt like, I've had past lives as a Native American, so that's part of it. There's some familiarity there. I had some experience, but this is much later in life because I was into various things. I did, various crafts. I did like Native American beadwork and things, things I just got into. And I sort of have a fascination with the Native American culture as a very like young kid. Another thing like this was that I didn't root for local sports teams. I was in Connecticut. We had the Whalers who sucked. It was a hockey team that no longer exists. They didn't, there just wasn't enough money in Hartford and Connecticut area. And so most people in Connecticut rooted for either the Boston teams, or the New York teams. Where I lived in Connecticut, we were 2 hours away, 2.5 hours away from New York or Boston. So you could drive up and go to, the whatever. So a lot of people were fans of either like the Red Sox or the Yankees or the Patriots or the Giants or the Jets or whatever it is. But I just didn't, and they were always on TV. That was like, we had 3 channels and those were the games you would see, right? You know, the local, whatever it was, the Boston and New York teams. And I just wasn't into that, right? Just because they were local teams. Like I never, wherever I lived, I never had that. Like I didn't say, all right, I'm moving to this city, so I'm going to support the local teams just because. Maybe I didn't like the style of play of the team or didn't like the players or whatever it was. So I would have my own specific, reasons for rooting for various teams and things. So it was different. I was like not fitting the mold in various ways. Like I can't really fully explain it, but I didn't understand that. Like I just thought, I was being a reasonable person, whatever. I mean, there was no self consciousness because I was a kid. It was just, what I did. And so there was a time I had to do like a research paper, and I was like maybe 10 or 11 years old, really young. I went to the library, and for some reason I found this book that said slavery was an economic war. And I read it. You had to do like some sort of report with using, sources, whatever it is, literary sources. And I did this, what I consider my first truther, work, was that I just happened upon this book and it made sense to me. And it talked about how the slavery war, the, Civil War wasn't about slavery at all. It was based in economics. The South was crushing the North because of, not just slave labor, but the, better climate and things, longer growing season, all these things. And so the North wanted to, dominate because that's human nature. And this is a big part of what I'm going to talk about here. They knew that the South would eclipse them economically. And so they made up this stuff about slavery. But you can see I've done, videos about this. Lincoln said very racist things about black people and said that, they weren't equal to white people and disparaged the idea of interracial dating and things like this and marriages. Like it couldn't be because, he was saying, you can go read the quotes. I've done this in an old video. At some point, I'll unprivatize those videos. But, Lincoln wasn't the hero that he's made out to be. He wasn't the, modern day progressive type of, person. I mean, he, inadvertently freed the slaves. So, anyways, I had a different perspective. Also, like I watched a lot of TV shows. What's Happening was a show I watched, and Good Times, and Sanford and Son that featured like African American characters. And there's things I watched like the movie Shaft and some of these other different like TV shows and movies, and I didn't see them as there was differences, right? Like I recognized that they were about people of a different color, but I was fascinated different cultures and things. Like I watched the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island, these other shows that were available. Like I don't know how many young people would understand the limitations of TV when I grew up, but I was looking for things that were somewhat different, right? That were just not the traditional type of things, and I like things that were I don't know, I guess multicultural would be the way that you would call it now. But anyways, as I got older, I realized that I didn't fit in. When I started to understand how other people saw things and how the cultural norms were, like just the societal norms, that I didn't fit in. Like I wasn't, I didn't identify. Even like when I watched the Olympics, I wouldn't always root for the Americans. Like it wasn't something where like if there was some compelling story or whatever it was from somebody from a foreign country, I just didn't have that type of mentality. Like I didn't think of myself as belonging to one group or another, right? And I had some experiences. My sister worked in the inner city, and I, had experience. I grew up in a suburb, but I had experiences with various cultures. My dad was a guidance counselor in an inner city school in Hartford, which the majority was probably like 1/3 or 1/4 white people, and then various other Hispanic and black people made up the student body. And I just grew up in a different sort of like I guess a more multicultural way. And when I got into high school, my best friend in high school was biracial, and like I didn't know how other people saw me until I was in high school, when I realized they would point out a lot of times that I was Italian, like it was a thing for them. Because back then, being Italian and Irish was looked down on. Like I just wasn't considered. I mean, there's a lot of people who were very traditionally white, right? That I went to high school with. And so pointing out that I looked Italian, of course, my last name was Romano, and that there was, some negative view on it. Like I just, whatever it was, right? Like a slight prejudice, and about I don't know when the Italians and the Irish immigration really came to America, but they weren't considered as good as the white people. Like that's how the system was. Catholics weren't, were looked down on in terms of the, white Anglo-Saxon, the WASP type people were definitely, viewing me as something else, right? In terms of their hierarchical view, right? That there was, there's various levels of, racial, whatever it might be, like in terms of their view of who are the best. And, you know, there's a hierarchy. And people have this across the board because I've experienced this in the various places I've lived across the country and, in other countries and things. And I'll come back to this. And my, best friend who had grown up in suburbs, all of his life and was, would identify, I think, as white, was prejudiced against. Like I could see, people would say things or whatever. He didn't really pay attention to it. But I could see there was racism. There wasn't like many black people that lived. We moved to Simsbury, Connecticut, which is sort of an ultra suburb. And so the black people, the African American people that were in my high school were either bussed in from Hartford or they were people who there was an ABC house. It's called A Better Chance, and they took kids from various types of what was considered underprivileged type of areas, and there was a house in which they lived in. And I, because I played basketball, I was friends with a number of these people, and there was like prejudice, like I said, what I experienced, where people were like, "Oh, you're Italian," like in a sense of, saying it in a not really a derogatory way, but you're different. Like you're, you know, like it's a more subtle thing than you see in the movies. There was no hate crimes. There was no, anything like that, right? But it was, you just didn't fit in, like if you were of a different demographic. And I wasn't all that conscious of it. But as I think back on it, I see that existed and exists everywhere. Because as I got older, I started to play basketball where sometimes I'd be the only white guy there. I was in high school and, and as I went on to college and I was, wanting to be a better basketball player. And many of my heroes, sports heroes, were, African Americans, Dr. J and Calvin Murphy and these basketball players, right? Moses Malone, some of these, you know, basketball players that I looked up to. And sometimes I would go play, and there was no, I would be like the only white guy, and I wouldn't even be aware of it. But sometimes people would be like, black people would be like, hey, white, like, pass the ball, white, like that was my nickname. But it wasn't in some, horrible, derogatory way, right? Like there was some difference there. Like they saw me, and I was the only white guy, so it was like, all right, you'll just call you white for today. Like there's no, you're in these pickup games and you're on a team for a little bit of people that are basically strangers to you. It's kind of one of the interesting things about playing park ball, street ball. I mean, sometimes there's, you go to a park and you're a regular and you make, friends and relationships and things like that. But sometimes, you play with people on their team for one time and you never see the person again. But one of the things I learned that I didn't understand was that, because I always have been observant. And so I noticed that, like people in the African American community, the black community, there was prejudices to do with skin tone, where they would be light skinned and black skinned African American people, and they would point it out in a negative way to each other. They would, like, talk smack about the skin tone, like all of, the various groups. And I went and told my best friend, I was like, my best friend was, again, he grew up in a suburb. His mom was German, she had a German accent. And his dad was African American. They were divorced. I never, I didn't meet his mom till, years later when we were in our 20s. But I said to him, there's prejudice based in skin tone. He was like unaware of it. I remember having this realization, and not just about, that, but also was going on in high school, because it wasn't just always about race. It was about money, or what kind of, how much money your parents had, or if you were poor, and what kind of clothes you could afford, or what kind of clothes you chose to wear if you were different. You didn't dress like everybody else, right? If you didn't, all the things, like there was ways that people would always find ways to feel superior to other people and degrade them. And that's across our society. Like and I found it to be a global thing. People always find a way to make themselves and their group to be superior, and that these find ways that these other groups aren't. And I noticed this at a young age. It's not, it's a part of the psychological deficit, the flaws of a human race, which I later understood there's a slavery aspect to this. Like just, even the people who you think are like whatever, the most popular kids in high school or whatever they are. And you can go to any school and find the kids that are on the top of the pyramid of the social structure, and those kids always have deep insecurities as well. Like they always, they feel like they don't measure up and they don't belong. I mean, this is something, no matter how successful people are, you'll find that they have, no matter how much validation they get from, they can be celebrities or whatever it is, they can be ultra wealthy and have all these things. There's deep insecurities that they don't measure up, and all of it. People have that. In fact, most people who become really successful and rich and famous and things, it's because they have, a need to be validated, because they have, even more insecurities and things. And so it pushes them to make it in some way, to prove to people that they're not a piece of crap, that they think about themselves inside, what they think about themselves inside. And this is, I mean, it's different in different countries, but it's pretty much a global thing. And it comes from the nature of human beings. I've talked about this before in other videos, based in my understanding of, like, there's some things in the heartfulness meditation that talk about this, but then there's all this research I've done on it. And it seems like about 5,000 years ago, there was, a genetic experiment, that there had been people on Earth, various different races that had like spaceships and, they were higher developed technologically. And they came to Earth, or they were, they needed a slave race. And they created a, genetic test tube type of human being that would be specifically be a slave, right, to be slaves here, and then left us. Like these were more evolved human beings, technologically and spiritually, that created a slave race and then abandoned the planet. And so leaving, and this is, I've backed this up with like some research and things, I mean, it's a theory, it's not something, but in the, Whispers of the Brighter World talks about how the human beings were created from a test tube, but it's something recent. It isn't the original human beings that were here on planet Earth, or maybe this happened, multiple times, that there's, this is an experimental planet, and, there was some terraforming and things done here. So it's a little bit, it didn't come about in a natural way. But there were people that used to live thousands of years on planet Earth, and there were giants and, various other types of human races here. And then about 5,000 years ago, these slaves were created, and, the beings that created them left, and there was many of us who were incarnate as higher developed human beings, that we were, a part of the first, or the, some of the original human beings that were here. And now we're incarnated in these, like, these flawed, genetically flawed, physically flawed in terms of health, and, a very short lived, instead of living thousands of years and things, which happened in the Vedic era. This is the Kali Yuga. When the Kali Yuga started, you had slaves left to run this planet, right? Genetically modified slave race. And that's why there's so much of this, insecurity and all the psychological problems, and a need to dominate other people and other, species and things out of this, feeling lesser than. I mean, this is my understanding. Like something, it's not a very specified narrative, but it's, something along those lines. That now you have a, group of, instead of evolving over centuries of, human evolution, you have these, slaves that were created for, various, projects and things on planet Earth, that were left in charge of the Earth, and then given technologies that were far beyond our maturity level and our capability, right? People who were, basically very primitive in our, evolutionary cycle, and then given the responsibility of nuclear weapons and computers and, cars and, all these things. So that's where all the problems come from, right? That this didn't come about in a natural way where we matured and evolved spiritually and psychologically, so that we were, wise enough and mature enough to handle the technology that's in our hands right now. And we simply aren't. And that, this is where the trouble is. This is the problem of the human experiment, the experiment of planet Earth, right? And so, that is whatever it is, but I'm just throwing that in there because that's why, that's my, understanding of the initial problem. But going back to my, my story here, that as it pertains to the subjects I'm going to cover, the, the modern day things that are happening right now to do with slavery, and I'll, back this up with some whatever, research or whatever you want to call it. But in my experience, as I got older and I got into my 20s, it started to show that whatever the American dream was and what you're supposed to do as an American didn't suit me. Like I didn't get it. Like it was, not my purpose. My friends started to find careers and, get married and start pursuing, the basic, American prototypical, the American dream prototypical lifestyle, where you get a job and you make money and you buy a house somewhere, right? You graduate high school and you either go to college or you get a job, and if you go to college, you get some sort of a career, and then you find a spouse and you have kids, and this is the purpose of your existence. And then you participate in whatever, right? Then you have kids and you train them to do the same thing. And it just didn't make sense to me. Like I just, and living for the weekends and sports and things, and I started to outgrow, a bunch of my friends and I had, we were in, various rec leagues and YMCA leagues for basketball, and we played flag football and, or just, like goofy stuff like playing, volleyball or something like that, right? Getting drunk and doing things that were, that you did in college, right? You live for the weekend to do whatever, right? You like, you work all week and then you go get drunk. Things that you would see like on the show Friends or whatever people did, when they become a young adult, is to, find their way into the paradigm, the, social structure. And it didn't make sense to me. I was like, there must be something else, right? I had been into God when I was younger. My mom had prayer meetings and things like this, but I had, started smoking pot when I had I fell out of off a zip line. I've talked about this in other videos, and then I started to drink and smoke pot when I was 15, 14 and 15, and then as I grew older, I didn't really think about God that much, but I had a spiritual orientation and curiosity, and but I wasn't. It wasn't religious based anymore because the prayer meetings my mom used to have, and I caught my parents lying to me a couple of times. It's stupid stuff, right? And being incompetent, and then I understood how fucked up all the other people were. There was some nuns and other people, and they weren't like, I mean, they were spiritual, but I didn't understand their flaws, right? I didn't understand their hypocrisy when I knew more about them. Like I was friends with some of their kids, and their kids were telling me about how effed up their parents were and all these things. Not in a way that was, they were angry or something. They were just being honest. And a lot of the way that society, talked about, like, say, drug use, what I was told about drug use and drug users. And then when some of my friends were like, yeah, I smoke pot, you know, and I started to drink alcohol and smoke pot, I'm like, oh, it isn't, they were trying to demonize people who did that. I mean, in terms of the religious hierarchy and all these things, all this fire and brimstone and, just society in general. And I was like, well, they're not being honest about this, right? Like, it's not as bad as they say it is. And, it didn't seem bad at all to me. But it does have a negative effect, right? And then when I got in my 20s, like all of those things, partying, drinking, how alcohol is a big part of movies and TV shows, people drinking, people my age now having a martini at lunch and things, which I can't even imagine just physically how you overcome something like that, right? You know, like I would have to go home and take a nap and probably get a headache and whatever else, right? So as I got older in my 20s, I wasn't fitting in. I didn't find my purpose. And I was, like it was a bumming time. It was a frustrating time for me. And the things I used to do that I used to enjoy, I didn't enjoy anymore. So this is getting into my late 20s. I had a girlfriend who I had been engaged to who was, our relationship just sort of fizzled out. Like all the energy went out of it. We were like, friends, but not, much more. And she got into therapy with a woman who was like a someone who had an MSW, but also was a medium, somebody who channeled. And then I ended up going into therapy with the same person. And so the therapy kind of helped. I mean, it helped in one way, which was help me identify the problem, at least the problem I was having, which was I couldn't continue doing what I was doing. Like I was, I needed a purpose. I needed to find my reason for being. And the therapy really didn't help me do that, right? But it helped me, realize all the things that I had been doing, all the things I'd engaged in. They were okay for when I was younger, and I mean there was reasons for them, but they weren't the goal themselves. And I no longer enjoyed those things, partying or, watching sports or even playing sports. But now I was just, I was getting older and I needed something more substantial. I needed, find the reason I was here for. And, I talked about being in a Rahu period from the Vedic astrology up until the time I was 28, which explains some of this stuff that I went through. And, I'm not going to cover that stuff again in Finding Heartfulness. But here's the, important part. It took like, a long time to get here. I thought this was going to be about 10 or 15 minutes at most. But anyways, I made my third attempt at college. I had gone to college 2 times and not understanding what I was going to do as, what my goal was for getting a degree and going out to the working world. I ended up, quitting, and I really wanted to just start working. I didn't want to go back to school, but I found this alternative program, right? Alternative college degree program. I would get a degree in human services, and I already had a lot of psychological credits from my other attempts at college. And they gave you, it was, a different way of getting an education. So it was in Massachusetts. I moved from Connecticut to Massachusetts, and it was like the sort of liberal 5 college area where there's all these, colleges and things, these UMass and Smith College and Amherst College. Just five colleges. That's why I call it the five college area, and it's kind of a neat little college town type of area there. And the university was in Springfield, which I was familiar with. My sister had lived there. The Basketball Hall of Fame is there. But anyways, this educational program was for people who were adults who had worked out in the world, were in their 20s or older, who had worked in the human service field to some extent. And you could get some college credits for work experience and life experience, which was interesting. And it featured a critical thinking model of education where you were, giving your opinion and doing your own analysis of the subject matter was important. And it trained people how to be critical thinkers. And it was on the weekends because most of the people who were in the program, all of them to some extent, had full-time jobs. They worked. And so it was weekend courses. And it was different than there was at a college, but it was a different program. And it came out of, it came out of the hippie movement to some extent. And it suited my learning style. And there was a lot of discussion and, long weekend classes, like 8-hour classes, right? And so it was, better for my learning style, being dyslexic and using, my critical thinking skills and all these things that, something that I'd already developed. And it featured a different view of history. It featured like some of the primary books were Howard Zinn's A People's History. And Howard Zinn, I know a lot of Republicans or people who are, conservatives don't like the Howard Zinn book because of their own limitations, but it has value. It had value to me. It's imperfect, but it is, it's written from the point of view of the oppressed. It's history from the point of view of the so-called oppressed or victims. Now, I'm going to talk about why it's flawed later. I'm going to talk about, because it's part of the ideology that's coming out now that's dominating the left, part of the critical race theory. And I'm going to talk about why it's flawed, but we're going to get to that. But I want to talk about first what value it has, what's good about it. Because the good thing about it is that history is always written by the victors. And that's, the history that you learned in school was from the winners, the conquerors, right? The people who were the oppressors and, the dominant group, right? I talked about the Civil War, for example, and what we know about the Civil War. Well, when the North won the Civil War, and they wrote the history about it, and that was accepted as American history, it was this idea that the North was the good guys who just wanted to free the slaves, and the South was the bad guys, the slave owners, and they were, the Confederates were the villains, and the Union soldiers were the heroes, because that's who won the war. If the South had won the war, it would have you would learn a totally different history. You understand this? And so whoever wins is going to make their side sound better. They're going to make themselves sound better. I mean, this is how it is in human day-to-day interactions. It's something everyone should think about, because whoever you're listening to is going to make their demographic and themselves sound better. They might be more honest or less honest, or, more, self, have some, introversion, have some self-examination. But depending on the person, and how honest they are with themselves is how honest the history and the story you're going to get is, right? Like you people who have grown up with divorced parents, and especially if it's a contentious divorce, you understand the narrative you get from your mom and the narrative you get from your dad are quite different. And so what was good about Howard Zinn's book is it told a different story from the people who lost the wars, right? From the slaves, from the native peoples, from the various other the other point of view, the other side of the story. And it didn't do it perfectly, just like all history books did. But I was very grateful to read it because I knew some of these things. I knew that the history I was getting was BS because of what I talked about, my nature, my how I was as a person, like even as a kid, that I didn't really believe the official story, and something inside of me was also nagging at me like, this isn't, the American dream and what you're being told here isn't correct. This isn't why you're here. This isn't your true purpose. And, there's a lot of BS here. Of course, my brother also, in my earlier 20s, my brother was a Vietnam vet, and he came out of the Vietnam War, and he became one of the first versions of the truth community. He eventually had his own AM radio station. He was into, the stuff about the Federal Reserve and, these various narratives that existed. And also stuff with UFOs. And, I was too young to really dive into it the way I have now, but he told me about these things and I knew about them. So I already knew, the official story, and someone who had been a Vietnam vet, and he had guarded the poppy fields because the U.S. Army was, taking, or the CIA or whatever it was, right, was using the opium money or whatever to fund things. Like, he told me all these things that he saw, some, effed up stuff. And, soldiers in Vietnam, or any soldiers, they come in with maybe a lot of patriotism and a lot of faith and belief in the American system. But then things happen to them in war, and they're abused in a certain way and used. And as they become adults, because they're young kids, 19, 18, 20 years old, as they become adults, they end up, having a sort of awakening. It's a big part of the truth community is ex-veterans. And so anyways, I already knew these things from my brother, and I already, from my own, differences of being a different kind of a dude, right? I was interested in this Howard Zinn and this other stuff, this other point of view of understanding the history and the way that the America was shaped from the people that had been oppressed. And now you can see that this is a narrative that's being rolled out. And a big part of the curriculum was to be engaged in some sort of activism, to be an activist, right? To create some kind of movement within the government or the community through activism. And so you had to have a project. And one thing that affected me when reading the, Howard Zinn's book was what an asshole Columbus was. And he was an asshole. So this is all documented stuff. It is factual. I mean, it is something that's been proven. That Columbus, when he first, sailed across the ocean blue, he came across this island in the Bahamas, and there was these native peoples there called the Arawaks. I think I'm, mispronouncing that, but whatever. And there was about 280,000 of them that occupied this island. And Columbus had to deliver something, but he wrote in his diary. They had excerpts from his diary. And he said these people are, innocent, and they're, childlike. He described these people as being, completely gentle and, not looking up to the people, looking up to Columbus and his men. And he said, with just a handful of men, we could subjugate them all, turn them into slaves. And that's what they did. And they demanded gold from these people, right? They had some gold, but it was limited. It was a small island. They pretty much mined the gold. And they were doing things like, cutting off their hands if they didn't deliver them gold. I mean, these were things that were documented. And they were getting carried around the island, like they built those, those structures where there's a couple handles like a royal person would have. And they would sit on the throne, the higher-ups, the Columbuses, and the higher-ups in the, the Europeans in their structure would get carried around the island like this. I mean, it was just, brutal. And the whole group of this indigenous people are extinct. They've been wiped out. They're gone. Like they were totally, killed by the, European oppressors, and Columbus led the way. And this has all been documented. And so, I was thinking about it because Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia and Columbia Broadcasting System, which is CBS, and then all, which some of these things I didn't know at the time, but all the things to do with Columbus, Columbus Day, Columbus statues and things. And this guy was just a real asshole, right? He was, a bad guy. And so for my project, and it was a group project, it was like my idea, was that, was to do with Columbus. And the idea was, the premise of the group was that if the American people were privy to this knowledge about Columbus, right? If they knew, what kind of person Columbus really was, then Columbus Day and Columbus being celebrated as, the hero and founder of America, because, Columbus is like the first version of George Washington, that if we got this information out there, people would agree to get rid of Columbus Day. And, now going through the truther stuff and stuff to do with heartfulness in terms of telling people about these things, I was so naive back then. I believed that other people would have the same sort of reaction I did to when I learned about Columbus. And so there was two other of my, classmates that were like, all right, yeah, I want to do this project. They agreed to do the project. And so the idea was to find some way to bring awareness to the, this alternative history and get it out to the mainstream. We tried to get, involved with local TV stations, and we tried all these various things. But what I realized was even within the school itself, and this was, a bummer for me. This was my first, when you talk to your sheeple friends and relatives about some of these truther narratives, and you think when they hear the information it's going to have an effect on them, and it doesn't. And I experienced this with heartfulness, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, and then with the truther stuff later on. And that's why, so many years later, I just expect almost nothing from people, right? And in terms of the way that they're going to process information and in terms of their reaction. But there was this one interaction. There was an African American classmate. The majority of people in this school were people of color. There was, maybe 10 or 15% were white, but there were a lot of people from New York City, particularly, that worked in the criminal justice system. A lot of prison guards that came up, and mostly, and I would say the majority, probably 60% of the students were women and things. And so there was an African American woman who I was, friends with, and I was telling her about the project. She had another project, and she said she liked the idea of the project, but she said, I can't get behind getting rid of a holiday because I enjoy my holidays, and I don't want to get rid of Columbus Day because it's a day off for me. And I was kind of stunned by this because she had read all the same things I had read. She had been in all these discussions, and she agreed that Columbus wasn't a good person, but didn't really care. To her, it was more important to get a day off. And then I saw this, even within the student body, they were like, whatever. They weren't. I mean, a lot of them expressed, because we, part of the curriculum was to express things about what we were reading, and Columbus was stuck out to everybody because, of the hero that he's presented and, what he was as a human being, like what he really was. And everybody, was upset about it when they read it and commented, but really, there wasn't much enthusiasm to do anything about Columbus, even in the class, even in my, school, and later on, with my project mates, the two people I was doing the project with, and it just started to get frustrating, and we didn't agree on certain things, and, we couldn't establish, there were some, basic fundamental disagreements. And I remember being just angry and frustrated and having this feeling of just wanting to force people to believe what I believed, right? I had this idea of, like making them, like I wanted to, make them, believe what I believed. I don't know how to put it, but when I thought about it, because I've always been introspective, I'm like, that's tyrannical. Like, what's really the difference then between me and Columbus, right? Like, what's the difference? Like, when people disagree with other people, you try to force them to agree with you, to impose your will on other people is very similar. Like, how much different was I than Columbus? Like, I wasn't like as much of an asshole, but I was still an asshole. Like, we were on the same spectrum, right? And I realized that I was the problem. That, it wasn't about activism, because, activism doesn't work. Like, I realized this. I've talked about this before. Protests don't work, and activism, because activism's usually always about changing other people to your point of view. It's this arrogance that you see something that other people don't, and then you're bringing this, you're creating some sort of change, sometimes in terms of laws, sometimes, whatever it might be, based in your belief, and using force oftentimes, because activism and protest and all these things, depending on what it is, forcing your point of view, which is happening right now through, and it happened before from the conservatives and the Christians. So, it isn't like you guys have anything to cry about because you did this for years and now it's being done to you and you don't like it, but it's a human problem. And so I realized the problem was me, that I wasn't, it wasn't my job to fix the world. I had to make myself a better person. And that's right after that I found heartfulness. Like it was like, within a month, I don't know what it was. But that realization that I had, that it was up to me to fix myself and not try to fix the world or impose my view of the way things should be on other people, which is essential to the heartfulness model. And so another unique thing happened, another sort of disappointing thing happened. Because when I first went for my initial individual sittings, when you get your heart cleaned and you experience transmission for the first time, I had such an unbelievable experience. I mean, my meditations now, like occasionally I have like, wow, that was amazing. Or I go to a gathering and the transmission affects me. But the contrast to where I was when I first started and the experience I had in my initial sittings, and most people, 90% of people, 95, I don't know how many, don't experience something this dramatic, something as big as I experienced. And I was like, wow, this is great. Like, and I was not an enthusiastic person. Like I had just been disappointed because whatever I sort of believed in always ended up sucking, always ended up being, not as good as I thought, as I imagined it would be, right? I was always disappointed by the hype of something, whatever it was, the American dream and all these things I'd pursued. When I got into it, I always found flaws and always found, it was, I mean, it's just things that I talk about here all the time. It was the first thing that was exceeded my expectations. The heartfulness system has exceeded my expectations over and over again, especially, that first day. And when I felt the transmission, I was like, wow. I said to the trainer, and he'd been doing this for years, does everyone know about this? Oh my God, if everyone did this, it's incredible, right? I had so much enthusiasm. So I told all my family and friends, and I went back to, I was in school still. And, I came in and I said, wow, I had this realization because the project that I was doing had been a failure. We had to present the project at the end. It was coming down to my last semester in school in this, very liberal, leaning hippie type of school, which was great in lots of ways, but was, deeply flawed, critically flawed. And I'll explain this, in this story. But to start off with, we had to, at the end, present our project. And, the project was a failure because my original premise, this idea that if everybody knew about Columbus, that things would change. And that was not, the premise was false. I was wrong. Like, I overestimated my brothers and sisters, right? That they wouldn't want to celebrate a man who had done the things he had done. And not just conservatives, but liberals. Like they didn't want to get rid of the holiday and all these things. This is back then. I mean, I found very few people that really gave a shit about it. And so, that was, you can't have a, when your initial premise for the project is wrong, it's doomed to failure. And I talked about that when we presented our project at the end. So, we still had these group discussions in our last semester, and I had gotten straight A's through the other, all my grades were A's up until that point. And then I came in, I had so much enthusiasm for heartfulness, I started to talk about the system, the heartfulness system, and like how great it was. And the teachers would shut me down. Like the teachers I talked about in various courses, they all were shutting me down, right? I mean, they wouldn't let me complete what I was saying, which was for a school that's based in critical thinking and education. That was I was like, wow, this is fucked up, right? I mean, it's really messed up. And my grades, I started getting B's and B minuses and things my last semester because I found an answer. And I said, look, it isn't about activism, it's about making yourself a better person and these things, like all the things that I realized, through the process in my project, that it wasn't about, I said it, I had to get rid of the part of me that was Columbus, right? It wasn't about me changing the holiday, changing the, structure. It was about me finding the part of me that's Columbus, because I realized that all the people had, oppressors in them. Like I saw this in my classmates and the teachers, like they were against oppression, but they still had their own inner oppressor. And you see that now in the liberal movement. And it's there in the conservative movement. Don't get me wrong. Like the stuff is there. It's historically there. Slavery was a horrible thing. And, the ways that the European people treated these indigenous people and, the slaves, the African slaves, was horrible. There's no, and I'll get back to that because that's important to something later on in this video. But all the other people, the so-called liberal people and people of color, had these same things inside them. They wanted to dominate other people. There was one woman who I was, friends with. She looked like Lauryn Hill, just a, very nice. I mean, she just had this like, nice energy. She's small though, like 5'1", and she was a prison guard. And, she had a couple of her coworkers there. And I, heard this story that she was, her fellow security guards that were also people of color approached her, and there's 5 of them, and said, you either have sex with one of us or we're going to set you up with the prisoners. Like they were going to leave her alone with the prisoners and the prisoners could do whatever they wanted with her, right? Like this is how effed up this, these prison guards were. And, and as I understood it, there was a lot of abuse and things based in these stories. And then I went to work in the human service field, and I'll, cover that briefly in just a bit. But the same kind of things that were supposed to be against, right, people in this college, in terms of the teachers and everything, they had oppressors in them. They were, had oppressive tendencies. They had abusive tendencies in them, like everybody does. And people have this. And so as much as people claim to be a victim, if they weren't the victim and they were given power, they would, and I'm going to go through this and document this in more ways, when they get power themselves, they're going to abuse it. It's just like the way human beings are here. It's fucked up, but it is. And I can go through it and show you. I'm going to get back to that. So just to get, to wrap this thing up about this school, the school brought me through a process, right, in terms of an internal journey, the educational program there, where through the, the curriculum and what my tasks, I realized that it wasn't about fixing other people, it was about fixing myself. And from that, the heartfulness system, partly that was part of the reason. There was other things that happened. But, in terms of the school, I ended up starting the heartfulness system, like partly, because of that process. And I, was given this answer, a way that you can make yourself into a better person through the transmission and the cleaning and focusing on your internal character, all the things I talk about, the heartfulness system offers. And then I brought that back into the school with a lot of enthusiasm, and my fellow students and particularly the teachers shut me down and, looked at me in a negative way. They didn't like the answer that I was given or the critical, thinking process I had gone through, right? And so because it didn't agree with the curriculum and the point of view of the school system, like I had outgrown it, and I understood like activism doesn't work, and I've demonstrated it over and over again in videos here. I've seen it. Protests don't work. Activism doesn't work because it uses force, and usually there's a group of people that don't want what you're pushing on them, and so you're forcing it on them, and that's happening right now. We can see from the liberals, it's happened for years, from the conservatives. But when you use force and you impose your will, then you're some sort of you're on the spectrum of Columbus and the slave masters and the king and the queen and all these people. When you're forcing other people to believe what you believe, then you're part of the problem, right? And human beings do that. It's one of the many effed up things that's essential or a part of the building block, the fundamental building block of human beings. And so I had that initial awakening, to people's ability to process new information when I did the Columbus thing. And then, I talked to all my family and friends about heartfulness, and, you know, and most of them reaction was bad. Like, the only person that started was my brother, the only person that tried it, and he thought that I joined a cult, right? And so, like, that was the next thing that I learned, that, I had this wonderful experience with the heartfulness system and felt it was my duty to share it with other people. And when I did so, the reaction was negative. It was like, they didn't want to hear it, and oftentimes judged me in some negative way and wanted to shut me down. And the only person that tried it was my brother, who later told me that he thought I had joined a cult and he was doing it to make sure I was all right. And he didn't feel the transmission at first, so even he had resistance. I mean, in the beginning, and it took some time, but he was won over. Now, he's a lifelong practitioner, and he's the caretaker of the ashram in Georgia, Molina. And so, you know, but those were the first two experiences with other people's ability to change when they were given new information. And so there's one more piece to this story, is the heartfulness, the heartfulness part, is that, when I went and met the other practitioners of the heartfulness system, and where I lived, it was mostly old white hippies. you know, Other centers there was more Indians, but like I had, my whole life been frustrated, and I wasn't somebody who was enthusiastic or would get excited about things. But I finally had found my purpose, the heartfulness system. And I had such a big experience. Like, I came in and I verbalized my enthusiasm. And these, older, they were all in their 40s and 50s for the most part. And some of the people who were trainers, there were 6 trainers or preceptors, they were called back then, in the area, the 5 college area. And a couple of them were, trying to tamp my enthusiasm down, the group as a whole. And I was, like at the time, I just, I didn't care. But now that I reflect on it, I could understand why it upset them. But having worked as a trainer for, a couple of years myself, and then just seeing the amount of people that come into the heartfulness system, especially back then, because it's gotten better now. But it used to take 40 people to start to get like one good one, somebody who was, could feel the transmission and was into it. And so in America, you would start lots and lots of people, and they would come and they would go, they would stay for a little bit, and, they would end up quitting. So to have some, enthusiasm and especially some youthful energy, would have been a good thing, but they were, they tried to suppress it. So that was, was going on for me in my school, and then even in the heartfulness system itself, right? So I had this big experience, and it was more or less rejected. you know, I mean, I was, happy. I was happy besides that. It didn't bother me, but I understood that, the effects of it even, more solidified this idea that it wasn't about changing other people, that it didn't matter if anybody else did it or whatever. It was that I found what I needed, and and just be happy about it, be grateful about it. I mean, I went through some frustration with all this, but at least I found what, my purpose was, and that's, that had to be enough. So I got my bachelor's degree, and all this stuff I'm going to say has, relevance to this idea of activism, faketivism, and people wanting to change other people and wanting to use force to do it. And this is both sides, the right, the left, the people in the truth community. So I have to go through this. It's, going to take a lot longer than I anticipated, but I think it's, worth it. So I received my bachelor's degree, and I went to work in a treatment center with sexually reactive kids who were basically elementary school level sex offenders. And I'm not going to cover that here because I've talked about that in the past. But I can say that the system and these treatment centers are not effective. And I got a second treatment center I am going to talk about. And they both had similar problems. But I went to get my master's degree in counseling at a small school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the program was a master's degree in counseling or a master's degree in art therapy. And it was very similar to the other school that I described. It was weekend classes, so it was, long weekend classes, but also classes during the week. It was older people. Many of them were the liberal sort of elite people that were trust funders living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A lot of them were women, a lot of gay people, and very liberal. It's a very liberal school. And it was a good school for counseling because it presented all the different psychological models during the hour-long weekday courses. And on the weekend, you would experience the model, the psychological model, from the perspective of being both a client and a therapist and a counselor. And so this was an experiential school, which was great because, there's no substitute for experience. You learn the academic stuff, but also had the experience. So it was a good idea, but the professors were often, when I talked about the heartfulness system, there was, because of the, it's a spiritual discipline. It doesn't do well with like New Age people and, people who want to fix the conservatives and the right. And a lot of these people were messed up. Like I said, a lot of them were trust funders and they had been in therapy there, from a majority of their lives. And they really, they thought, well, they would make good therapists because of that, right? But most of them weren't very therapeutic. And, I just saw a lot of stuff that was effed up. In fact, like it took me 3 years because I had to go at a slower pace because I was working part-time jobs and I had a family. It was a 2-year program. And the original group I went through was so full of like assholes and access to personality disordered people. And there's a girl who had never been in any of my classes the first 2 years who I met. And she was like, that group was such assholes. So I was like, yeah, we were talking about it. She said like one time she just unloaded and said, you guys are all out of your fucking minds. You like all this kind of stuff. And she was like, and then she sat back. She's like, wait, did I just say that out loud? And she said she had all these problems with the people that were going to school there. And then there was another woman I met. I worked in a treatment center. This was like a dry out center for rich people in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Like, sort of wealthy, some famous people came through there. People who were, addicted to one thing or another. And that was another effed up place, money-making place. I mean, the therapy that was being done there, a lot of these places I've worked in, they should be all like almost criminal level fraud, right? But there was a girl working there. She was Native American, and she had gone to the same school I did, and she had, only 3 credits left to graduate. But the teachers, she had some sort of disagreement with the teachers there. Again, these very liberal teachers. And like she felt like she couldn't go back to the school. It was like completely effed up. And I'm saying this because these places are supposed to be change agents, right? And I, need to cover this here because a lot of what you see, this agenda that's being rolled out, comes from the psychological world, the world of counseling and psychologists and psychiatrists. And so I did my internship and then I got my first job at these places that are outpatient clinics. And the majority of these places serviced impoverished people. And the way it works is these people who came in there were almost 100% of the time on Medicaid. So it's an outpatient clinic in an impoverished area for people who are on Medicaid. And Medicaid at the time, I don't know what it is now, but back then they paid $45 for an individual session, for an hour session, and $120, I think, for a psychological assessment. And so in both the internship and then, the internship was in Idaho. The job, my family moved back to the 5 College area, which I first started, right? So it was about 10 years later. So I returned to that area where I first started Heartfulness and went through my, undergraduate degree. It was probably maybe about 7 or 8 years later. I'm not sure how much. So these outpatient clinics were so focused on money. Like the internship, they had sort of when we had staff meetings, they would announce the person who booked the most client hours at the beginning of the session, right? At the beginning of the group meeting, and everyone would applaud and almost be like jealous. Oh, you won again, right? So it was almost like a sales meeting because this person brought the most money in for the agency. And it was like a bunch of stuff I saw there. I'm not going to get into that. But then in this other place that I worked, this outpatient clinic, right? You were on the hook to bring in as many, like 30 bookable hours, 25 bookable payable hours per week. And you would do that by doing psychological assessments, which again paid $120, and then do individual therapy or create your own groups in the community and do things to get paid, to bring in this money, right? And they had some, existing contracts at schools and things, and you could go in there and do some time at these schools. But, the majority of people, the majority of clinicians didn't make the cut, right? Didn't bring in the amount of bookable hours. And most of them were women, and a lot of them were insecure. A lot of people who go into therapy are kind of screwed up, right? Have their own psychological issues. And so you had a couple month grace period to kind of get up to speed. But you soon found out that there was no way to book enough of these payable hours through Medicaid. There just wasn't enough clients available. So what would happen was parents would bring their kids in to see a psychiatrist who would prescribe the kids meds. And they had to bring the kid in like once a month to see the psychiatrist, and he would make sure the meds were working and there wasn't any negative side effects. And psychiatrists were always these pill pushers. They were like the worst of the worst. Arrogant, because they're medical doctors, so they're sort of above all the other psychologists and counselors. They have more education, and they're really arrogant, but mostly what they do is write scripts for psychological meds that are just brutal and have lots of side effects. But so many of these kids were ADHD, they would come in and get Ritalin or whatever those various medications were back then for Ritalin, and the parents would bring them in, and then the parents were supposed to bring them back in on a weekly basis, so they would have therapists for somebody in my job, like in a clinician's job, the job that I was doing, in the hopes of the kid learning to deal with their problems so they could get off medication. I mean, that was the model, right? And they would get, $40, $45 per hour session. So the kid would come in and you'd get 1 credit, 1 hour credit for that, for those appointments. But what would happen is the kid would come to 1 appointment a month when they had to go see the psychiatrist, and the parents would set up 4 more appointments and then just bag them, right? And so you had to, establish that as part of your schedule, right? And then you had probably between 5 to 10 cancellations a week, if not more. And so those were all hours you were counting on, right? And again, this is a business model. It's not so much about therapy. The therapy wasn't going to do anything because the kids were eating, candy and processed foods, and they were living in an environment. Sometimes their parents were drug addicts. I mean, just they were in such a horrible situation. Of course, they were ADHD, right? And, they were just being given medication by their parents to get their kids to shut up, right? So they could, get a moment's peace and the kid could make it through a full day of school. And the parents didn't want to, didn't have the ability. Many of them didn't have cars and things, and they didn't want to, make the effort to bring the kid in for therapy where, that wasn't going to actually do anything, right? And so, you tried to do psychological assessments because they brought in a lot of credit hours. And again, your job one was to bring in credit hours, right? Bookable hours. And, that was the pressure. And then you would meet with your supervisor and they would say, how many bookable hours did you get? And then after a couple of months, they said, oh, you're not making it. They would take your vacation time and dock some of your pay. I mean, it was like 26 grand a year. It was some like ridiculous amount of, money that you couldn't even live on. And they were taking your vacation hours and taking some of your pay back and things because you weren't booking enough hours. And I talked to some of the, these were young women, like I was in my 30s, I was just, older. And these girls were just fresh out of graduate school, but they had been working there longer. And they were like, they felt insecure and they were having their own psychological issues and feeling inadequate because they couldn't meet the grade, but they were also talking about how the place was abusive and they felt exploited. All the things that a place like this, which is supposed to be about helping people in therapy, was, in the abuse spectrum. And so then I ended up quitting that job and I went back to work at another treatment center, this time as a clinician. I was in the milieu working in a cottage in one treatment center with young sex offenders. And then I was working with teenage sex offenders. These kids were older as a clinician and as a therapist. And I'm getting tired, and this is a long introduction, but I just want to cover this briefly. I've talked about in the past. This place was really abusive. Now, on paper, the idea of the place, which was using the pathways model, the assault cycle model, to teach these kids who had, acted out sexually about their offending behaviors and helping them to come up with a treatment plan and apologize to the victims and take responsibility for what they did, and then come up with a relapse prevention plan so they could leave and live normal lives, was a good theory. It was good in theory. If the kids got the proper therapy and they were properly motivated and they wanted to change, which most of them weren't, and the place itself wasn't abusive, which it was. Now, it said it was a nonprofit organization, and I'm not going to go through all the effed up things I saw there because this place was a nightmare. And they, abused their clinicians, my job, because most of the people that work there as staff used to work for some manufacturing plant that closed. They were massholes, right? Massachusetts has a certain brand of asshole that's called a masshole. And these guys they're not into therapy. And they held a lot of the administrative positions in the residential and school sections of the treatment center. And my boss was which I later learned, she didn't have her ability to supervise. She wasn't, she didn't have her clinical license, but she was operating as the clinical director. Like you have to have she had an MSW, and you get a clinical license, you need so many hours and you have to pass a test. And she didn't have that, which is effed up. And she was so stressed out, she was on a variety of different opiates to deal with her debilitating migraines. And she was kind of a deceptive person. The staff all were undersupported, and there was oftentimes they would leave a staff position, a counseling position, clinician position open because they wanted to not have to pay the salary, and you would run group therapy with 24 kids, which was crazy, just nuts. And there was a rapid burnout. People lasted, as an average at both of my treatment center jobs, 9 months. And a lot of the kids were, they had been convicted of adult crime. Some of them were 15 years old. They had parole officers. Some of them had done something like they were a 17-year-old kid with a 15-year-old girl, and there was some manipulation, but not what I would call a pedophile, like somebody who had, had some, it wasn't a good person, but they weren't as bad as some of these kids were, going to have 3,000 victims. There was this one kid, he was a nightmare. I never worked with him, but everyone who did said he was a complete sexual deviant. He had acted out sexually throughout his time at the treatment center, and so he was, he wasn't better at all. But he was somebody who was put in there by his school. His school, didn't prosecute him criminally, nor did the victims that he had. But he was, he didn't have any, parole officer or something. The school didn't want to pay for him being there anymore, but he clearly was going to be released into the wild again as a predator. His goal was to be some sort of Boy Scout leader. And his therapist was so upset, she was weeping, because she knew this, it was like a horror movie where she knew this guy was some sociopathic pedophile that was going to wreak havoc in his community, and she couldn't do anything about it. And he was leaving without any conviction, so it wasn't like he even had to report to people. And so there was these varying degrees of kids that were there. Some of them were much worse than others. And the guy who was the administrator in charge was this Russian guy. He had a beard, and he looked like some kind of villain that would be in a Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone. Huge guy, 6'5". He didn't look therapeutic at all. And he wrote this email to the clinicians and the case managers. There was a cottage, and the cottage had 24 kids, and 2 clinicians, my job, and 1 case worker who dealt with the the sending agency, the agency that was responsible for payment, whether it was a social worker or a parole officer or a school, whatever it was. And so he sent this email out saying, don't let any of the patients out, the clients out, until we have somebody to take their bed, right? Like he didn't want any empty beds, even though most of the time the place was on a waiting list. And that's one of the, both places I worked at, they were on a waiting list. Like a kid would leave and they would have a new kid in that same day. I mean, just across the country, there's all these like little sex offenders running around. I mean, it's crazy the volume and amount of these kids, and most of them had been sexually abused themselves. I mean, it's a plague. It's just one of the many plagues of the human race, right? But this guy, the guy in charge of the treatment center, wrote this incredibly abusive email saying that if your client had completed his treatment program, it lasted about 2 years, 2.5 years in some cases. It could go as quickly as 18 months, but no kid finished it that quickly. But it was 5 3-month sections, groups, and there were some breaks in between. So it usually took about 2 years, maybe a little bit more. But if your client had completed his treatment plan and was ready to leave, he had graduated, you were supposed to imprison him there and not let him leave until they had someone to fill his bed, which is off the charts abusive, violating the client's civil liberties, but also making some school system or social worker pay, was like $110,000 or $109,000 a year, maybe 118. I can't even remember, but it was over $100,000 a year for these kids to go through this treatment program. And, the taxpayers in one way or another were paying for this, and all across the country. And this place, which was supposed to be therapeutic, and it would like totally wasn't, and was, it was just about money. It was supposed to be a nonprofit. And it was, I remember this one time that they made about $9 million a year. The place cleared about $9 million a year. So there was this time that the guy who ran there was a bunch of these treatment centers and schools. Like it was a corporate, conglomerate. It was nonprofit, but they were making a ton of money. And this guy who ran it, he was a CEO, came in with a bunch of the executives and all dressed in like suits and stuff. Like I remember one time they came in, the guy was like, wanted to play basketball with the kids or something, and his shoe got scuffed up. He's like, these are $500 alligator shoes to these kids who are, like totally, a total disconnect. And so this group of people were walking across the campus, right? This is right before I was about to leave. And there was this one kid, he could be really good, but he could also be like a nightmare. He had like a split personality. And he was ready to leave, but we didn't feel comfortable that he could go out into society. He was too much of a nightmare at times, right? He would just snap. And we were walking across the campus. I said, hey, look, these are these important executives. Like, don't say anything to him. Like, don't sabotage yourself here. But he was in a bad mood, right? We were walking up to the counseling building, and he starts cussing him out. Like, hey, you MNFers, like, hey, you rich, like he just starts laying into him, like just yelling. He could be really loud. They're all staring at him, and I'm tired not to crack up because it's really funny, but it's, totally inappropriate for me to laugh. And, it was just this effed up place. But the point is that therapy, which I could go into a whole thing about, is problem centered, and it comes from this liberal ideology, but it's also a systemic, it's a systemic institution. They never blame the system, but they'll blame individuals, right? And they'll blame, now you have it where in the social workers and the whole social system, but there's this idea that liberal people, know more, and it's the right-wing conservative abuser, the white man that has been a slave master and has been keeping people down. But all across the board, I've seen this with people of color. I've seen it with, liberals. I've seen it with women, all these different groups, people, in the gay community. They all have these types of tendencies, right? Have abusive type of tendencies, and will try to impose their will on other people the same way that the so-called man, the white male privilege does, right? And so that, I just wanted to, give some context to what I'm about to say here and then show you some evidence of this. This is a long introduction, but let's get into this movie trailer. So I saw this trailer for The Harder They Fall, which is from Netflix, which always sucks. Obviously comes from the woke agenda, and it was promoted on YouTube Trends. And this is the inspiration behind this video.
What the hell are you doing? That ain't nowhere to board a train, you damn stupid nigga.
So this dude this white guy was about to call her the N-word, and she shot him. And, seems like a very over-the-top response, but it's going to get worse here.
Open it.
Our first tune is called Let's Start What We Have Come Into the Room to Do.
So I guess this guy Idris Elba, who is some sort of a mayor, it shows later, of a town, has been arrested based in the fact that these guys are the heroes unjustly. That's the premise. And these soldiers here have been holding him.
Right on. Here goes. 1, 2, 3.
So they open fire and slaughter the white soldiers here. And the black cowboys unload and start to shoot all of them. And these are, like a metaphor for modern day police. And these, it's racially, the murder of these white people is racially motivated. So what's being said here is that this guy is imprisoned illegally. These white people are, oppressive, racist slaveholders, including the guy who was the conductor of the train, and they all deserve to be shot and killed for being white and abusive and being, the authority figures, the gatekeepers like the racist police of today. And it's a racially motivated slaughter, right? You don't see that in movies where the heroes, again, maybe, in the John Wayne times, you'd see it with Indians and things. In the 50s, you would see white people murdering or abusing black people or Native Americans in movies and TV shows that were quite racist. But now it's reversed itself. Instead of saying, all right, like that behavior is wrong, whoever's doing it, that behavior is wrong. Now these guys are the heroes because they're black cowboys killing white soldiers, aka the police.
You do know how to make.
And so I'm not going to show the rest of the trailer because Netflix sucks and they copyright things. But that's the opening part of the trailer. This message that white people are bad and should be killed just for being abusive white people. And the heroes, and you're a hero if you do such behavior. So like many people, I believed that, I knew there had been slaves and historically, but the idea of slavery is something we attribute to white people. Like even in our distorted history, but certainly for me reading Howard Zinn's book, but even in our distorted history, this idea that white people kept slaves and, white people are bad for doing it has always been there, right? And it's true. Like white people did keep slaves in America. There was a slave trade in Europe. The Europeans and England, specifically, and white Anglo-Saxon people were the ones that had the most slaves. Here in America, there was white slave owners, abusive slavery, there was lynching. All those things were true, right? But the idea that this behavior is exclusive to white people, which many of us believe, is completely wrong. And so I'm not defending, like there's people who will comment and saying, there'll be white people who comment on my videos, and that's happened in the past, and said that the slave thing is completely wrong, it didn't happen, or the black people deserve to be slaves, right? Whatever, I've had all these various points of view. And those points of views aren't welcome here. That's an auto ban. And that's, I'm not justifying white slavery, the slavery of white people enslaving black people, or indentured servitude or even the wage slaves of today. But this idea that white people are the ones who are the big slave owners, the big, the abusive slave owners exclusively is wrong. There's 40 million slaves around the world. 71% of them is female, and this goes from every country and really the Western world less so, right? There's less of these slaves in America and Europe in terms of white people, and this happens more in third world countries. But slavery is alive and well. These are actual slaves. I'm not talking about wage slaves, which makes up about 80 to 90% of the population globally, because wage slavery, where you have a job and you're basically owned for some period of time, and again, it's better than being an actual slave, but you're a slave for a wage, is also a form of slavery. And I'll cover that more. But to understand this, this is from the Khan Academy, African societies in the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, but it says here, African societies participated in human bondage long before the Atlantic slave trade began. Famine or fear of stronger enemies might force one tribe to ask another for help and give themselves in bondage in exchange for assistance. Similar to the European serf system, those seeking protection or relief from starvation would become the servants of those who provide relief. Debt might be also worked off through some form of servitude. Furthermore, prisoners of war between different African societies oftentimes became enslaved. So there were slaves in the indigenous people. This happened in Australia and Native America, which I'll show you. This type of slavery, but slavery was alive and well outside of Europe and white people. There's been slaves for the past 5,000 years we know about. That slavery, a big portion of the human population has been down with slavery. Here, it says it here also in Wikipedia. Slavery before the transatlantic trade. This is, before white people started to take black people out of Africa to become slaves. When the slave traders were African, and this has been well documented as well, that there were black people in Africa that sold slaves to white slave traders to go to America and Europe. And so oftentimes you had slaves, people who were slaves already in Africa, were sold by Africans to white people to become slaves in other countries. So that changes things a lot, right, in terms of the liberal agenda. I'm not, again, excusing the white people who, enslaved people. I'm just saying everybody sucks. The white people certainly sucked. The white slave traders certainly sucked. But, everybody sucked, right? There was this stuff going on in every race and demographic across the globe. I mean, for the most part, there might be some peaceful, isolated communities like the Arawaks I talked about earlier, on some island or something, where people lived in, harmony. I mean, maybe, in isolated areas. But for the most part, for 5,000 years, there's been slaves, right? And this is, something that everyone has to consider, that it's a function of the human condition. Also, Native Americans had slaves. I mean, there's Native Americans who owned other Native Americans, especially the same kind of thing with prisoners of war. And so when you had two warring tribes, the victor would often take slaves. And so there were slaves. The Native Americans were slaves. Also, the Native Americans some of them were brutal fighters. Like, they turned back the Vikings. And when the Vikings showed up here, the Vikings were savage. The Vikings, just destroyed Europe. And, my daughter studied the Vikings in homeschooling. And, if they had a baby that was deformed or in some way wasn't perfect, they'd throw it on the rocks. I mean, just brutal kind of stuff, right? Historically, not a group of people that were to be messed with. But when they came to America, they were here way before Columbus, and they got their asses kicked by the Native Americans that were here, who were very, warlike and were very tough themselves, right? And there was a dense population, but the Vikings gave them diseases, and it decimated the populations of Native Americans on the East Coast. And so that's why Columbus and the people that followed him were able to get a foothold in America, because that coast got cleaned out by white man Western diseases. but there was slaves there and slaves in other indigenous populations. And so this is something that, is well known. But also in the Bible, we know in the Old Testament, Moses, the Exodus from Egypt, there was slaves all throughout the Middle East and through, the Hebrew culture and Christianity. In the, Christian tradition, there's slaves. Slave is talked about as not, necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's not condemned at all in the Bible. So the Bible documents slavery that was there 2,000 years ago. Of course, we know in Egypt there were slaves, which is a part of Africa, right? The Egyptian pyramids, which I believe were built by extraterrestrials, there were slaves at that time. And so we know there were slaves throughout the Middle East and Egypt, throughout Europe. There were serfs and slavery throughout the native cultures, the tribal cultures in Africa and in America, and in Australia there was slaves. All these places. Human beings take slaves, is my point. Also, in terms of Islam, the Quran recognizes slaves as morally and spiritually equal to free people. So it doesn't condemn slavery. And there were slaves within the Islam community, within, the Muslim population in the Middle East, right? You get in a picture here that there's been slaves from every group, every ethnic group, and every religion. I know there were slaves in the Mahabharata because I read it, and there were slaves in ancient India. And you can say in many ways the caste system is a form of slavery. So you have in all these major religions the mention of slavery, and it isn't condemned. It doesn't say slavery is a bad thing or shouldn't be, they shouldn't exist. In fact, the religions oftentimes make it sound like slaves and being slaves is natural and, just appropriate. And the legion of slaves, women slaves in the Mahabharata. And then there were slaves in ancient China and the Orient and all these various places in that part of the world, throughout Asia, all of these continents and all these different races and people. There was slavery in Japan and things. Japan had to apologize to China for things they did in World War II and other things, right? And so these are all these races around the world. There's been slavery. Pre the European enslavement of Africans in America and in Europe. Again, these slave-owning societies in China. And then I thought about this phrase, and I remember I saw this book, 5,000 Years of Slavery, but it talks about slavery in modern times and that slavery still exists. Because human beings suck, and slavery is a part of the human condition. So to condemn white people alone and make it sound like white people are the only racist people, the only people that would take slaves, the only people that would be abusive, is, it's not backed by fact or history. Not that white people should get off the hook for all the bad things white people have done, but it's across the board. This is human condition. There is, an abuser inside everybody, right? A potential slave owner, and it's something that people do. So I saw this because it was, I wanted to include this because it has to go with the discussion here. So this is Scottie Pippen, the famous basketball player. I always liked Scottie Pippen as a basketball player. And, I liked him more than Michael Jordan. He seemed like he was a better human being. But he had, good basketball skill. But he recently accused Phil Jackson, his former coach, of being a racist. And that might be true. I don't know. Whatever, right? Phil Jackson was, not a good person. I think he's more of a weasel. But he said this on the Dan Patrick Show. And, it shows just the way things are right now. And I'll explain in just a moment.
To succeed. Michael Jordan is not there. So who's next in line for you?
But have you talked to Phil about this? Because by saying a racial move, then you're calling Phil a racist.
I don't got a problem with that.
So what this is about is Michael Jordan was the alpha male, the main, he was the man on the Chicago Bulls team and then the best player in the league, the dominant figure and dominating. He was ultra competitive and liked to dominate and crush. And you'll hear the Killer Instinct stuff, which is all a part of abuse and being like a a master-minded person where you want to dominate and subjugate the other people. And Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant were famous for this type of killer mentality and were praised across the sports world and certainly in the African American community having the killer instinct. And Scottie Pippen was his Robin, right? His, Batman and Robin or whatever it was, right? And then Michael Jordan went to play baseball and Scottie Pippen became the alpha male of the team. And they were playing the New York Knicks, and I saw this game. And this happened.
Scotty, Phil just said you weren't in because you asked Sal to play.
Yeah, pretty much.
Or you weren't involved in it.
Exactly.
When you say exchange words, what happened?
I have no comments on that.
But the Bulls survived without Scotty. Tony Kukoc hit a 22-footer to win it for the Bulls.
And so this guy came over from Europe. He was paid more money because Scottie Pippen. So this happened in Michael Jordan's documentary, The Last Dance. There's Phil Jackson looking kind of douchey, Michael Jordan looking, dominating and domineering. And so this came up about how Scottie Pippen refused to go back into a game, and Michael Jordan sort of, talked badly about Scottie Pippen, saying like he's never going to recover from that. He quit on the team and how bad it was, even though he was, he quit on the team to try baseball, which he sucked at, right? But he was hammering Scottie Pippen for quitting, which is a big thing in sports. And the reason Scottie Pippen says that he didn't go back in the game is they were down 2 points to the New York Knicks, and Phil Jackson drew up a play for Tony Kukoc. And Scottie Pippen wrote in his book that it was racially motivated because Scottie Pippen was the rightful heir to Michael Jordan, because Michael Jordan would have taken that last shot. He would never have tolerated, and he would never have let Tony Kukoc take the shot. But Tony Kukoc was a much better shooter than Scottie Pippen, who was more of an all-around player. And so he wanted Scottie Pippen to throw the inbound pass and Tony Kukoc to take the shot. And Scottie Pippen, who said he had waited so long to be the man, right, to be the dominant figure, and it was his rightful, place for going through all the things he went through. I mean, that's what was going on inside him. And he would never have been able to take the shot if Michael Jordan was there and be the hero. But he felt like it was his turn. And he felt that, Phil Jackson was doing this because it was racially motivated. But Scottie Pippen has been taking a beating about that he had just insulted some players, and people are always bringing it up about him quitting. And he, so he tried to reverse the story and give his point of view, which is being rejected. And so he ended up playing the race card, which, wasn't appreciated because he doesn't know Phil Jackson's motivation for wanting Tony Kukoc to take the last shot, not Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen is, speculating or whatever. Like if he has proof or other stories that would be examples of Phil Jackson being a racist and that Phil Jackson chose Tony Kukoc because he wanted to promote a white player, then he should, you have to have more than what he's presenting here, right? Like I can understand that he was pissed off that he didn't get to take the last shot, but then when you're just going to throw out these allegations because everything now in the media is, well, that guy's a racist and there's racists everywhere. And so then there are these two guys on this show, Brother from Another Mother. And so this is a show on MSNBC. And they were slamming Scottie Pippen for what he said here, but also said that Phil Jackson could be a racist. And then this one guy said this.
It's a tough position to be in if you're Phil Jackson. If you are, especially if you don't think you are. Now, if you are,
well,
you can say, hey.
Well, hold on.
Right.
So,
welcome to,
so Michael, welcome to America. Therein lies the problem. Because there are plenty of white people, white men specifically, for the purpose of this conversation, but white men and white women walking around in their power and their privilege, who if you had them fill out a questionnaire asking them, are you a racist, would of course check the no box. Yeah. Most of them don't even know what the term means.
See, the reason I included this in here, because this language about privilege and all these things that are there, right, that are now considered facts by the left, and the media is endorsing this, and the powers that be and everybody else is pushing this narrative that it is, divisive, in that there is so many different types of white people, right? There's different types of black people, people of color, different skin tones, but different ethnicities, different, like people from different parts of Europe and Russia and all these different types of Caucasian people and different cultures. And many of them had nothing to do with the slavery that took place here in America. My ancestors, my grandparents came to America after slavery was already, after the Emancipation Proclamation, all those things. My relatives came here. My grandparents came here in the early 1900s, and so slavery was already a thing of the past. But once you have a group of different ethnic groups, different religions, whatever the thing is, whatever the differences are in your demographics as a country, and you make one group the victim because of things that happened in the past, and one group the abusers, and then you try to flip the power structure as you see it based in that narrative, the whole thing comes toppling down. Because again, I've said this in so many videos, Americans all have privileges. There's an American privilege, and it comes at the abuse and exploitation of other countries, right? And so you have all these groups of people that, when you have rich people and people of privilege, people of wealth, people of royalty, then they're always going to have to be poor people because you're using their resources. And also this idea of cheap labor or slave labor. And what you have now is a lot of Americans, different demographics, people in the black community, Hispanic communities, Asian communities, and the gay community, all claiming to have been victimized by the white people with their privilege. But how many of those people want to, acknowledge the, American beastly system and our military and our unfair economic policies globally, and the everybody has an article of clothing or something in your house that was made by slave labor or in a sweatshop or something. Multiple items, your phone, your shoes, your, whatever it is, that we are getting cheap products from other countries because of the unfair, currency devaluation of some countries on overpopulation and the exploitation of people, basically slave labor, because we're all benefiting from cheap labor in terms of, you go to Walmart's full of cheap labor and slave labor and, sweatshop labor and things like this, products that come from there. And I've said it before, all these demographics that are claiming victimhood at the hands of the white oppressor aren't willing to give back or, support these other oppressed groups if it means that they lose their privileges. Because when you have slaves, when you have people who want, and I'm going to get into this more, I'm in the editing process, but I already made the ending of this video. And so, you got to find the abuser within you and the person that, wants to benefit from whatever, dominating other people or having the ability to have people serve you because of your wealth, right? Because you have people, the way that we characterize success in America is wealth, that you have the possibility to become wealthy and famous, rich and famous and all these things. And so if you're a rich and famous person, that's the pinnacle of American life. And if you're claiming to be oppressed, right, and that your group is oppressed, but there's lots of people in your group that have achieved this goal of wealth and privilege so that you can, have people serve you in whatever capacity, you're paying them, but still it's a form of wage slavery, right? I mean, the system in itself, like we have to scrap the whole system, right? If you want to get rid of the abusive element, then you can't have wealthy people and then, a few wealthy people, and then all these other people who serve the system, the wealthy people, and keep it going, who are in some way, are being mistreated. So I just have made like almost 2 hours of content here. My voice is kind of cooked and sore, and I feel sort of worn out. Just went for a walk with my 2 dogs, and I want to start off with the ending here, the conclusion of this thing, that most people think that the way to fix the system is to go after the villain, go after the bad guy, go after the abuser, and the victims should rise up and take down the abuser, and that the victims are, in a sense, the heroes and the abusers are the villains, and the victim has to rise up and take down the abuser. But the simple fact of the matter is that in every victim is a potential abuser, is a future abuser, and in every abuser there is a victim in the center, a victim stance. I've talked about this in the past. So I want to come back to that. Hopefully I can restate that pretty much verbatim. But the idea here is that both the victim and the abuser are, coming from a place of victim consciousness, and they are hyper-focused on the abusive activity. And so they don't see the solution, because the solution exists outside of the cycle of abuse. Hopefully I can remember all this and restate it. But I first want to say this. The reason I think I have a unique perspective, other than the things that are, odd things that are make me different, dyslexia and whatever, introversion things, is that there is a certain humility that I live with because of, just my knowledge of my own limitations. And, many people who watch these videos think I'm arrogant. I come across as arrogant. And, you need to have some sort of edge, like to be on the internet. You need to have, like, whatever it is that I have to, survive the negativity of the internet and all of it, right? Like I am as I need to be to do this work. And, there could be some whatever people might attribute as arrogance. And, I was called aloof by Master Chargy. I don't know, how much that still exists or not. But in terms of my humility, the thing that makes me a humble person is that before I did heartfulness, I was failing at everything. That I was a failure on pretty much every level. I was under-functioning. I was a person with, a lot of different types of talents, like a near, genius IQ, a quick mind. I had, I guess a good heart, which I wouldn't have listed as one of my assets, but that came about later when I started doing the heartfulness system. I was, a pretty gifted athlete. I had probably what would be considered Division I, Division II talent as a basketball player. I was funny. I was physically strong, things based in my genetics. So I had various levels of talent and was pretty much failing all across the board. I had dropped out of college twice and was clueless in which direction my life should go. I hadn't held a job for longer than a year, was just waiting tables anyway. A job was, no job of significance. In terms of my romantic life, I hadn't been really in a long-term relationship and wasn't equipped with the social skills and the, whatever it is, the interpersonal skills to have a sustained relationship, have a marriage. I couldn't deal with stress at all. Like I had a very limited ability to deal with stress of any kind, and I would just sort of shut down. And even though I was a good basketball player, I didn't do anything with it. I couldn't muster that into something, playing on a team and having some sort of success, anything that people would consider success. So I was, a loser, a failure on every level of my life, right? And then I started doing the heartfulness system, and I was able to do better in everything. I was just able to get better and do better and become a better version of myself. This YouTube channel would suck if I wasn't doing the heartfulness system. Nobody would listen to me. Again, it's the heartfulness system that has brought out a better version of me in terms of these videos and has accentuated my gifts and my insight and my, abilities in general. And certainly my ability to sustain stress and difficulties and miseries and problems has gotten so much better. So, people could look at me and go, well, you're this, you're that. And if that's the kind of person that does heartfulness, then, I don't want to do heartfulness, viewing my whatever perceived negative qualities. But what they don't understand is that I'm a much better version of myself having done and continuing to do heartfulness. And so that's how the system should be judged, right? And so in my case, I'm well aware of the pre-heartfulness Paul Romano and the, heartfulness Paul Romano, and I know the difference, right? Like I know it. I experienced both of those versions. And so it's not so much about doing the heartfulness system, but it's having a sustained internal relationship due to the cleaning and transmission. Also, the cleaning, there are lots of times where I feel gross, I feel, spiritually heavy, whatever it is. I get a clean, I get a sitting, I get a transmission, I go to a gathering, and I feel refreshed. I can see the difference, and it's happened like so many times that, the heartfulness system gives me, a boost, right? It refreshes me. It makes me, like new and innocent again, right? It happened over and over again, where I have a more, positive perspective because of the, availing myself of the services. And it's not the system or the name heartfulness or being a member of the organization. It's the fact it connects you to God on a deeper level, or connects, some people to God on a deeper level that do it and benefit from it. And that connection with God makes a person in, connection with the soul and doing what you're supposed to do and getting on your soul's path makes you a better version of yourself. And, there's lots of people who have been successful on their own, without God, or at least they're not conscious of God or their soul. They have better samskaras and, through their self-effort, they've been able to achieve things. And so they're not nearly as dependent on God or aware of their liabilities or their weaknesses. And that's, something that actually hurts them. Where I am somebody who, because of being basically a loser without heartfulness and just, a low functioning person, a complete underachiever, without it, I know the difference. And it gave me a sort of insight to things that other people don't have about the effectiveness of bringing God into their life. There's other people like me who, couldn't do it on their own, and then they connected to God in some deep level, and they were able to, do such a better version of themselves, produce such a better version that they know what I know, that is, without God, you're so limited. Even if you think you're successful, even if you're good at a few things and, you can do whatever you think, whatever. You have some accomplishments. If you add God to the equation and you do it successfully, you will bloom in ways that most people can't imagine. And so the problem is that most people are missing that and aren't really willing to try it. They're afraid of giving up control. Their ego doesn't want to give up control. And that's the biggest problem with human beings, and face what they've done and all these things. And that's the real problem. It isn't this stupid idea of changing the external, ruling class and switching one demographic for another, which is doomed to failure because every demographic has assholes in it, right? Like I've seen this because like I said, I've had a multicultural life where I've engaged with, people of different demographic and different races and things like this. I mean, I lived in New Mexico for a while, and, I knew a lot of Mexican people. I had a lot of Puerto Rican friends and people, and when I was in, the Northeast area, when I lived in Florida, and there was Haitian people and Cuban people I associated with, right? I mean, I had friends with all these various demographics. Of course, I played basketball. There was times that, there was a period in my life when I was playing basketball that, about half of my friends were black, and, my best friend from high school and things was a biracial person. So I had all these, different experiences with American demographics, some interactions with Native American people in New Mexico and things. Lived in different places also because there's cultural differences. I lived in the North. I lived in the South. I lived in the Southeast. and I lived in the Northwest and the center part of America. And so I've lived in about, I don't know, 8 or 9 different states, and I've been through other different states, and then, of course, lived in the Virgin Islands, island people. That's a whole different, demographic, and Indian people. And then the various types of social, different social constructs. I, went to graduate school. There's a lot of gay people, and I had gay friends when I lived in Northampton, Massachusetts. I had, some women, lesbian bosses, a couple of lesbian bosses at my first treatment center, coworkers, people that were, my friends or whatever. So I have had friends in every demographic and know people, and there's wonderful people. And then, of course, going to the Heartfulness Ashram in Chennai, now in Hyderabad, but it used to be in Chennai, and there were people from all over the world. I knew people from Madagascar, like one guy from Madagascar. There was a time that Master Charji sort of blessed my book, The Choice, and all these people came up and wanted to buy copies of it. And there was this guy from Madagascar. He was the first one to buy it, and I see him for every once in a while. I'm just saying that because, it's kind of a weird place. It's a little island outside of Africa. And I have, lots of different people I know from Russia and the Ukraine, and there was people from Vietnam at the ashram, and, Romania and Australia and all these different places. So I've met people from all around the world, many people that I consider saintly, really good people, but there are a lot of assholes, right? Like in all these different countries. In every demographic and every, social construct, there's going to be the same kind of people. There's going to be the people who are saintly, and they're the, people who do all the dirty work, and they, they're going to work without, wanting any recognition, and they just enjoy doing the work, and they have positive attitude, and they're always, they have positive energy they're exuding, and they just sort of prop everybody up around them. Then there's going to be, people like me that are, on the outskirts circling the fire, who aren't really, engaged as much, loners and people. Then there's going to be, the lots of people that just sort of, they go through the motions. They're not really all that conscious. They don't really care about too much. They've sort of mailed it in. I mean, that's the majority of people. And then there's going to be people who are just real assholes who have, a chip on their shoulder, and they have, something to prove, and they want to dominate other people, and they think they're just more arrogant. They want to impose their will. And those are the people that are usually going to rise up to leadership positions. And the majority of other people just don't care about it, right? They're like, all right, as long as you promise to take care of me, then, I'll be okay. And so in every one of these demographics, there are people who would engage in some form of slavery, and even everybody to some extent, it's part of the human condition to want to dominate and make other people or animals or robots or whatever it is do your bidding for you. It's something that people have. They want to be kings and queens. They want to be royal people. They want to, get special treatment. They want to be served. They want to be, whatever it is. And that's, a part of the human condition. It's something that's existed. And then there's other people that have some, craving to be slaves, right? There's a lot of people who feel comfortable being slaves. They like being slaves. They may not admit it. They like being victims. They like being slaves. And there's, these two groups, the ones that like to be victims, like to feel sorry for themselves, like to get pity from other people, and the, people who are slave owners and abusers are the ones that are, the ones in control more than anybody else. They're sort of guiding humanity into the abyss. So going back and repeating what I said at the beginning of the video, this conclusion part, that, every victim has an abuser inside of them. Because if you've been abused and you think of yourself as a victim, then you've internalized your abuser. You've internalized the person that you are, that has wronged you. And it might be a group of people. It might be, you've been oppressed as a demographic, like people in these so-called protected demographics who all view that the white man and the white man with his white privilege has abused all of them. And they are hyper-focused. They've internalized that, archetype. They've internalized the slave master, the abuser, the oppressor, and they're meditating on it all the time. And that's one of the teachings of the heartfulness system. Whatever you meditate on, you become. And so those people who are hyper-focused on their so-called abusers and are taking on the role of the mental consciousness of the victim will meditate on the abuser and want to take the abuser down, but it will consume them and they will be given power, and this abuser that they've internalized will manifest himself and they'll become the abuser, right? So every person who's been abused and doesn't cope with their abuse and focuses on their abuse because they have a memory of the abuser, they have, an image, an idea, they have a narrative inside of them of the abuser, and they, feed that narrative, and it, metastasizes and grows into a cancer, and it takes them over, and so eventually they become the abuser themselves. This happens in so many different ways. Even if it's self-abuse, it's the internalization of their abuser that they have, given all this power to abuse themselves and, whatever it might be. And so this is what everyone needs to know, that victims are not potential leaders, because if you consider yourself a victim, then you are ultimately going to turn into an abuser, because, the victim consciousness, every abuser, at the other parts of this, every abuser is a victim inside. And from my work with the assault cycle, there is a victim stance, there's a victim statement that every abuser gives them themselves, a poor me statement, to give themselves permission to do wrong things. So this idea of victim consciousness that's perpetuated, it's here in the truth community. Most of the people listening to this video feels like a victim of the so-called elite, and so much victim consciousness that people are like, oh yeah, I'm being oppressed and by whatever, by YouTube or by Facebook, and they're deplatforming me and they're censoring me and the government is taxing me, and I'm all, and people consider themselves a victim of all these things, right? Of all these various oppressors. Every demographic sees themselves as a victim, and if they could just take down their oppressor, the world would be a great place, right? They would make it good. It's the oppressor that's the problem. In the truth community, the oppressor is the so-called elite, like the Cubies would do a better job, or any, people have to free themselves of victim consciousness and take on the mantle of being a true leader. Like this idea of the movie we just saw, the movie clip, that these, black cowboys were killing their white oppressors, and that was somehow justice and going to make the world a better place. But I've seen it, in my own experience with the African American community. You see it in rap videos and, the various, levels of culture and sports. This idea of being a dominator, dominating other people. I mean, in the rap videos, in the rap culture and the gang culture that's promoted, all this stuff to do with drugs and guns and having money and, abusing women, the misogynistic aspect of it, right? All these things. Beating other people up, keeping other people down, right? All these things that are verbalized. And so the abuser is alive and well in all these other demographics. You'd see it in any of these demographics that sees themselves as a victim, and most people see themselves as a victim, and so you can't really lead from that place. You have to take responsibility for your life and the things that are done to you, and the full knowledge, and I've said this before so many times about the heartfulness system, that everything that you experience is something that you deserve, like in a samskaric way, or something your soul has signed off on. Like in the heartfulness system, the teaching is, in ancient India, there was a lot of cursing, like all these saints would curse people. Balaji, the first master of the heartfulness system, said, you could only curse somebody if they had it inside of them. They had this, you could say, all right, like I hope something bad happens to you, whatever, right? You fall off a cliff or something. Well, they would have to have that samskara inside of them for the curse to work. If they didn't have sometime in the future, they were going to fall off a cliff. And so, the curse just pulls it out to the forefront. And so in that way, the curse might have even been a blessing, because it's removing something from your samskaric pattern, something negative that you have to go through, and, making you a purer person on the inside. I mean, it's a wonderful understanding that you have these samskaras, and your soul chose your body, chose your, race, chose your sex, chose everything about what you're undergoing right now. And there's a reason for it. There's a plan, and you just have to be patient and endure it with some sense of gratitude and understand that this isn't happen randomly and you're not being victimized, that there's a reason for what you're going through. Maybe something you did in a past life, maybe something your soul wants to experience, whatever the reason is, that the things that are happening to you are just on a godly level. They might not seem fair on a human level, like in terms of cause and effect. You're like, what did I ever do to deserve such horrible treatment? Like that, pretty much everyone can probably say that at one time in their life or another. But if you discount where you were before, or what your soul wants you to endure, or what the benefit of your experience, your negative experience you're going through, then that would change, right? If you understand that you're going through this negative experience for a reason that will benefit you on a spiritual level, and God is giving you this blessing even though it feels like a curse. And so going back to the initial premise of this video when I told my stories about how I came to the conclusion that each person has to get rid of the negativity in themselves, right? They have to get rid of the problems that they are bringing into this planet, the problems that are, a part of their soul, a part of their spiritual essence, the poor qualities, and rise up to a higher level and connect to God on a deeper level and become the best version of themselves. And then you're fit to lead, right? In the heartfulness system, there's a teaching where, Babaji said that if a person wants to be a master, they can't be one, right? Like that very idea ruins them for their entire life in terms of being able to achieve that, because it's an egotistical idea of the externalization and the powers that a master would have, like a, master of the heartfulness system, someone with, all their spiritual centers open and these powers. And if you have that kind of an ego, you would be corrupted by the power, because the power would manifest those flaws and egotistical tendencies in your system. And so the purification of your soul, of your subtle bodies, of your samskaric patterns, and become a pure version of yourself and throw off all of the egoism and all the negative things and selfishness and desire for power and all these things, want to force other people to believe what you believe, and then surrendering to God and surrendering to the, God's will and God's plan, and understanding what needs to be done and doing the work without any sort of complaints, and with humility and a, heart full of love and devotion and service and duty and all these things. And so those are the kind of people who don't want to be leaders. I mean, being a leader, being a administrator is a difficult thing, right? Something that I've shied away from because I don't really have the qualities for it. But, to be a true leader, you're responsible for other people. You don't get to just enjoy the perks and celebrate your privileges of being the king, right? You're responsible to help these people move to a higher level of consciousness and help those people be the best they can be and do what's best for them, make the godly decisions for them, whatever your leadership position needs you to do, right? But the problem with being a leader, even a good one, is that people suck. Your subjects will more than often, I've seen this over and over again, in every demographic, and, the heartfulness system being some of the most developed people because of the system, it's like the best system to help people evolve. People make the wrong decision time and time again. It's just, it's sad, but it's true. People will self-sabotage and take the low road. And so I've been talking about this in so many videos lately. The only thing that's going to change humanity for the better is some sort of catalyst that shakes people up, because right now people aren't choosing. The choice is there for them, but they don't want to make the choice. Their egos, their selfishness, their desire for egotistical power and control outweighs their soul's purpose and God's will. And I went through this, if you heard my story, when I first heard about Columbus, and thought that if everyone understood what kind of person Columbus was, they would want things to change, and that was wrong. And then when I told my, friends and relatives and students, fellow students about heartfulness, that, I thought, oh, wow, if people knew about this, they would do it and, they would benefit and it would change the world. And, that was wrong. Like I experienced that. Then again, with the people in heartfulness who tried to shut down my enthusiasm, right? Again, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying these are things I went through. And then becoming a truther and, all those types of things. And then telling sheeple and other people about this information. And this idea was out there, that there would be some like information war, like that was the whole Alex Jones thing, that if enough people got this information, things would change. And now we see that that was never true. Like that was not only not possible, but was never true. Because information, people don't have the power to change things. The people who control the system don't give you the power to, don't give you an outlet in which you can change, right? You can change the system, but you can change yourself, right? And so like I've been through this, and again with the heartfulness system and telling people about it through this YouTube channel. And so I just expect very little from people. I don't expect them to do the right thing or what's best for them or even consider it, because I've seen it over and over again. The majority of people don't want to do anything. They don't want to change themselves, and they just want to keep the status quo. And so there'll be some choice points coming up. Things will get shaken up. There'll be some depopulation. People will be shook and rattled, and we'll see. We'll see if that prompts them to take the high road. I don't know, but that's the only solution for humanity. You're not going to fix the system. You're not going to fix the oppressors. You're not going to turn everything. What's happening now is that people who control the system are wanting, a racial war and wanting the demographics to fight each other so they can absorb more of the resources and wealth and then present a new deal in the aftermath that nobody would accept now. But in a, apocalyptic situation, people will accept it because they'll have no other choice. But in reality, their power is fading, the system's crumbling, and, there's only one choice people can make to navigate this whole thing, and that's to connect to God on a deeper level, the heartfulness meditation, and rise up and change and bring about a transformation of the human condition and humanity as a whole. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paul Romano, definitely reporting for the Apocalaughs and the Ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.